In the entire recorded history of the galactic communion, spanning 14 billion rotations of the central star, no species had ever been stupid enough to strap themselves to a tube of burning fuel and launch themselves into the void just to see what was out there. Every known civilization had developed gravity manipulation first. Every known civilization had built safe, elegant vessels that bent the fabric of space around them like folding a piece of cloth. Every known civilization had done things the right way. And then there was the ship. It came tumbling out of the dark between stars like a thrown rock. No energy signature that made any sense. No gravitational field manipulation. No quantum fold wake. Just a crude metal cylinder, scarred and dented, spinning slowly on its axis as it drifted through the outer boundary of the Torvain system, at a speed that should have been impossible for something so primitive. Commander Valeth of the Torvan Border Fleet stood on the observation deck of her warship, the Quiet Tide, and stared at the object on the magnified display with all 6 of her eyes. She had served in the fleet for over 40 rotations. She had encountered rogue asteroids, dying comets, and once a derelict vessel from a civilization that had gone extinct 300,000 years ago. She had never seen anything like this. The object was ugly. That was the first thing she noticed. It was not designed to be beautiful or efficient. It was designed to survive. Thick plates of some crude metal alloy were welded together in overlapping layers, like the scales of some ancient beast. Portions of the outer hull had been patched and repaired so many times that the surface looked like a quilt made of scrap. There were burns across the nose of the thing, deep scoring marks where it had clearly passed through the atmosphere of some world and been dragged through the fire of re-entry. And despite all of that, despite the damage and the crude construction and the complete absence of any known technology, the thing was intact. It was whole. It was still moving forward. Valeth felt something cold settle in her chest. She did not know what she was looking at, but something deep inside her, something older than training or rank or protocol, told her to be careful. Analysis, she said quietly. Her second-in-command, a young officer named Drayan, stood at the scanning console with his 4 arms moving quickly across the interface. His skin had gone pale, which meant he was nervous. Drayan was never nervous. Commander, the object is approximately 90 meters in length. It is composed primarily of iron, carbon, and trace amounts of other base metals. There are no exotic materials in its construction, no element heavier than lead. The propulsion system appears to be chemical in nature. Specifically, it seems to use some form of controlled combustion to generate thrust. Valeth turned one pair of eyes toward him, while keeping the other 2 pairs on the display. Combustion! You mean it burns something and pushes itself forward with the explosion? Yes, Commander. The bridge fell silent. Every officer on duty turned to look at the display. Combustion-based propulsion was something they studied in the earlier stages of education, the way that fire had been discovered and then quickly abandoned by every intelligent species in favor of something better. It was a relic concept, a footnote in the history of technology. The idea that a species might use it not just to leave the surface of their world, but to travel between stars was not just impractical. It was insane. Is there anything alive inside it? Valeth asked. Drayan's hands moved again, scanning for biological signatures. The hull is dense, but our sensors should be able to penetrate. One moment, he paused. His skin went from pale to almost white. Commander, there are biological signatures inside the vessel. Multiple signatures. I am reading at least 7 distinct life forms. They are carbon-based, oxygen-breathing with a high water content. Body temperature is significantly above ambient. They appear to be warm-blooded. Warm-blooded, Valeth repeated, in a metal box. Drifting through the cold of space, with combustion engines. Yes, Commander. Valeth stood very still for a long time. She was a military officer, trained in protocol, trained in first contact procedures that had been established by the Galactic Communion thousands of years ago. Those procedures were clear. When an unknown vessel was encountered, you made contact. You opened communication channels. You extended the greeting of the Communion and offered assistance and guidance. The Communion had welcomed over 900 species into its fold over the millennia, and every single one of those first contacts had followed the same basic pattern. An advanced civilization would detect the newcomer, reach out, and gently guide them into the wider community of intelligent life. But every single one of those newcomers had arrived in a proper ship. A ship with gravity drives and quantum fold engines and energy shields and all the other markers of a civilization that had reached the appropriate level of development. The Communion did not make contact with species that had not yet achieved faster-than-light travel. That was the rule. You waited until they were ready. This thing, this ugly, scarred, burning metal cylinder, had no faster-than-light capability. It should not be here. It should not have been able to cross the vast distance between star systems without it, and yet here it was. How far is the nearest star system in the direction this object came from? Valeth asked. Drayan checked. The nearest system along its trajectory is approximately 4 light-years away. A small yellow star. Unremarkable. No record of intelligent life in that region. 4 light-years, Valeth said softly. At the speed this thing is traveling, how long would it have taken to make that journey? The silence that followed was longer this time. Drayan ran the calculation twice before he answered. At its current velocity, and assuming it has been decelerating as it approached our system, the journey would have taken approximately 73 of their local years, possibly longer. Valeth's blood ran cold. 73 years. By the standards of any known species, that was a significant portion of a single lifetime. These creatures had climbed into a metal box, pointed it at a distant star, and accepted that they might spend most of their lives inside it before they arrived. They had done this knowing that their fuel was limited, that their hull was fragile, that the void between stars was cold and empty and merciless. They had done this anyway. Open a communication channel, Valeth ordered. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. Standard first contact frequency. Universal greeting protocol. Drayan activated the communication array. A beam of carefully modulated energy reached out across the space between the quiet tide and the unknown vessel, carrying the mathematical sequences that every civilization in the Communion used as a basic greeting: prime numbers. Simple geometric ratios. The universal language of mathematics that transcended biology and culture and history. It was the handshake of intelligent life, the first word spoken between strangers who shared nothing else in common. They waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The crude vessel continued its slow rotation, drifting forward on its own momentum. Valeth began to wonder if the inhabitants were dead. 73 years was a long time. Perhaps they had not survived the journey. Perhaps the biological signatures were residual, or perhaps the creatures were in some form of suspended state from which they could not be roused. And then the vessel's rotation began to slow. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but the instruments detected it immediately. Small jets of gas erupted from nozzles along the hull, crude attitude thrusters that fired in precise bursts to arrest the spin. Whoever was inside, they were awake. They were responding. A light appeared on the hull. A single blinking light, pulsing in a rhythm that was clearly artificial. It was not a mathematical sequence. It was not a universal greeting. It was just a light, blinking steadily, as if to say, "We see you. We are here." "They are attempting to communicate," Drayan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they do not appear to have the capability to receive or transmit on our frequency. Their technology is too primitive. They cannot decode our signal." Valeth nodded slowly. "Then we adjust. Find whatever frequency their equipment can receive. Radio waves, electromagnetic pulses. Whatever they use. Match their level." Drayan's hands moved across the console. It took several minutes. The equipment aboard the Quiet Tide was designed to communicate across quantum-entangled channels that could span galaxies in an instant. Dialing it down to simple radio waves was like asking a master sculptor to draw with a stick in the dirt. But eventually, Drayan managed it. "Channel open," he said, broadcasting the universal greeting on primitive electromagnetic frequencies. They waited again. The bridge was absolutely silent. Every officer stood at their station, watching, barely breathing. And then a sound came back. It was not a mathematical sequence. It was not prime numbers or geometric ratios. It was something entirely different. Something that no one on the bridge had ever heard before. It was a voice, a single voice, speaking in a language that none of them understood. But the tone was unmistakable. It was calm. It was steady. It was confident. It carried the weight of someone who knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. even if what they were doing was absolutely insane by every standard of the known universe. But it was not the voice that made Commander Violet's blood freeze in her veins. It was what came next. Behind the voice, underneath it, woven through it like a thread through fabric, there was something else, a pattern of sound, a rhythm, a collection of tones and frequencies arranged in a way that was clearly deliberate, clearly structured, clearly meaningful. It was not speech. It was not communication in any functional sense. It served no practical purpose. It carried no data, no coordinates, no technical information. It was music. The creatures inside the metal box were playing music. Valeth stood perfectly still as the sound washed over the bridge of the quiet tide. She did not understand the words. She did not recognize the instruments. But she understood, on some level that went deeper than language or culture or species, what she was hearing. She was hearing something that had been created not because it was necessary, not because it served a function, not because it advanced any practical goal. It had been created because someone had felt something so deeply that they needed to give it a shape, a form, a voice. It had been created because silence was not enough. The voice spoke again, clearer this time, and the translation systems aboard the quiet tide began to pick apart the language, searching for patterns, building a rough framework of meaning. The words began to take shape on the display, fragmented and incomplete, but gradually becoming clearer. Ground control to Major Tom. Valeth read the words as they appeared. They meant nothing to her. She did not know what ground control was. She did not know who Major Tom was. But the way the voice spoke them, with a mixture of loneliness and wonder and defiance and joy, told her everything she needed to know about the creatures who had built this impossible ship and hurled themselves across the void inside it. They were not explorers in the way the Communion understood the word. They were not scientists conducting careful, measured expeditions into the unknown, with every possible safety measure in place. They were something else entirely. They were dreamers. They were the kind of creatures who looked up at the stars and felt something pull at them from the inside, something that could not be satisfied by knowledge or logic or reason alone. They needed to go. They needed to see. They needed to touch the darkness and find out what was on the other side, even if it killed them. And it very nearly had killed them. The scars on the hull told that story clearly enough. The patches and repairs, the burn marks, the dents and fractures that had been sealed with whatever materials were available. This ship had been through hell. It had been battered and broken and put back together again, over and over, by hands that refused to give up, by minds that refused to turn back, by hearts that beat with a stubbornness that bordered on madness. Drayan looked up from his console. His skin had returned to its normal color, but his eyes were wide. "Commander, I am beginning to decode their language. It is complex but follows recognizable patterns. I believe I can establish basic communication within a few minutes." "Do it," Valeth said. She turned back to the display and watched the crude vessel floating in the void, its single light still blinking steadily. She thought about the creatures inside it, 7 of them, warm-blooded, breathing oxygen, wrapped in metal and fire, 73 years from home. They had crossed the impossible distance not because they had the technology to do it safely, but because they had decided to do it anyway. They had looked at the gap between what they could do and what they wanted to do, and instead of waiting until the gap closed, they had jumped. The music continued to play through the bridge speakers. Violet did not turn it off. She listened to it, and for the first time in her long career, she felt something she could not name. It was not fear exactly, though there was fear in it. It was not admiration, though there was admiration in it. It was something closer to awe, mixed with a strange, uncomfortable recognition. These creatures, these primitive, reckless, impossible creatures, had done something that no species in the history of the Galactic Communion had ever done. They had arrived before they were ready. And they had arrived singing. "Commander," Drayan said quietly, "what do we do?" Valeth was silent for a long moment. The protocols were clear. Species that had not achieved faster-than-light travel were to be observed but not contacted. They were to be left alone until they reached the appropriate level of development. But the protocols had been written for species that stayed on their own worlds until they were ready. They had not been written for species that refused to wait. "We greet them," Valeth said finally. "We greet them and we find out who they are. She straightened her uniform, clasped her hands behind her back, and faced the display. Behind her, the bridge crew moved to their stations with a new urgency, preparing for something that none of them had trained for, something that the Communion had never anticipated. First contact with a species that should not exist. First contact with creatures who had crossed the stars in a metal box powered by fire. First contact with the beings who sang in the dark. And somewhere, drifting in the space between two civilizations that had never imagined each other, the battered ship continued to transmit. The voice continued to speak. The music continued to play. Ground control to Major Tom. The stars were listening. The translation took 11 minutes. Drayan worked faster than he had ever worked in his life. His forearms a blur across the console as the algorithms chewed through the alien language, pulling apart syllables and vowels and consonants, matching them against patterns, building a dictionary one broken word at a time. It was messy work. The language was dense and irregular, full of exceptions and contradictions. Words that meant one thing in one arrangement and something completely different in another. It was, like everything else about these creatures, stubbornly impractical. And yet it worked. It communicated. It carried meaning in ways that the clean, logical languages of the Communion never had. While Drayan worked, Valeth ordered the Quiet Tide to match velocity with the alien vessel and hold position at a distance of 2,000 meters. Close enough to communicate, far enough to react if something went wrong. Not that she expected hostility. The ship had no weapons that her sensors could detect. No energy weapons, no projectile launchers, no defensive systems of any kind. It was completely unarmed. It had crossed 4 light years of empty space, through regions where rogue asteroids and cosmic radiation and 1,000 other invisible dangers could have destroyed it at any moment, with absolutely nothing to protect itself except its hull and the stubbornness of its crew. Valeth found this both terrifying and strangely moving. The Quiet Tide settled into position alongside the alien vessel, and for the first time Valeth could see it clearly through the direct observation ports rather than on a display. It was even uglier up close. The welding seams were visible to the naked eye, thick ridges of melted metal where plates had been joined together by hand. There were sections where the hull plating was a completely different color than the surrounding material, patches that had been added later, repairs made with whatever was available. One section near the aft of the vessel appeared to have been sealed with a substance that her sensors identified as a mixture of metallite compounds and some kind of organic adhesive. They had literally glued part of their ship back together and painted on the side of the hull, in large symbols that were clearly meant to be read from a distance, was a word. The translation systems processed it quickly, and the meaning appeared on Valeth's display. Wanderer. They had named their ship Wanderer, not Conqueror, not Dominator, not Explorer or Pioneer or any of the other grand names that civilizations typically gave to their first interstellar vessels. Wanderer, a word that implied no destination, no purpose beyond the journey itself. A word that said, we do not know where we are going, and we do not care. We are going. Valeth read the name 3 times and felt something shift inside her chest. Translation matrix is functional, Drayan announced. It is rough, Commander. There will be errors and gaps, but we should be able to communicate at a basic level. Open the channel, Valeth said. Transmit the greeting. Drayan activated the communication array. This time, instead of mathematical sequences, the Quiet Tide sent words, translated into the alien language, spoken by the ship's vocal synthesizer in tones calibrated to match the frequency range of the alien voice they had heard. The message was simple. We are the vessel Quiet Tide, representatives of the Galactic Communion. We greet you in peace and offer our assistance. Please identify yourselves. The response came faster than Valeth expected. The voice was different this time. Not the calm, steady voice that had spoken earlier, but a new voice, rougher, slightly breathless, carrying an edge of excitement that was barely contained. The translation appeared on the display in fragments, some words clear and others approximated. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the Earth vessel Wanderer. We are representatives of the United Nations of Earth. We come in peace. We've been traveling for a very long time, and we are very, very happy to hear another voice. Earth. The word meant nothing in the Communion's databases. No record. No file. No mention in any survey, any catalogue, any archive stretching back 14 billion rotations. These creatures and their world were completely unknown. Valith composed her response carefully. Captain Vasquez, we welcome you. We have many questions. Your vessel and your method of travel are unlike anything we have encountered. Can you tell us about your species and your world? There was a pause. Valith imagined the alien captain standing in whatever passed for a command center aboard that battered ship, surrounded by her crew, trying to decide how much to say to the first non-human intelligence she had ever encountered. It was a moment that every first contact scenario anticipated, the moment where two strangers decided whether to trust each other. This time it was slower, more deliberate, as if the captain was choosing each word with care. We are human beings. We come from a planet called Earth, third from our sun. We have been a spacefaring species for approximately 200 years, but our technology is limited. We do not have faster-than-light travel. We do not have gravity manipulation. We built this ship with what we had, and we launched it knowing that we might not survive the journey. There were originally 12 of us. 7 remain. Valith read the words and felt the cold sensation in her chest deepen. 12 had left. 7 had arrived. 5 had died during the journey. 5 beings had climbed into this metal box knowing the risks and had not lived to see the destination, and the remaining 7 had continued. They had buried their dead, or whatever ritual they observed, and they had kept going. For 73 years they had kept going. We are sorry for your losses, Valith transmitted. We understand the sacrifice your journey has required. Thank you, came the reply. They knew what they were signing up for. We all did. That is the human way. We do not wait for perfect conditions. We go with what we have and we figure out the rest along the way. Valith turned to Drayan. Get me everything you can from their transmissions. Cultural data, historical references, anything they have broadcast. I want to understand these creatures. Drayan nodded and began pulling data from the Wanderer's communication systems. The humans, it turned out, were broadcasting constantly. Not just voice communications, but a continuous stream of data that included images, text files, audio recordings, and something that took Drayan several minutes to identify as compressed visual narratives. Movies, the humans called them. Stories told through moving images and sound. The data poured into the quiet tide systems like water through a broken dam. It was chaotic and disorganized and overwhelming in its volume and variety. And as Drayan and his team began to sort through it, the picture that emerged was unlike anything the Communion had ever seen. The humans were young, catastrophically young by the standards of galactic civilization. Their recorded history spanned barely 10,000 years. Their industrial capability was less than 3 centuries old. Their understanding of physics was advanced in some areas and laughably primitive in others. They had split the atom before they had learned to stop fighting wars with each other. They had reached their own moon before they had figured out how to feed all of their own people. They were a species of contradictions, brilliant and foolish, compassionate and cruel, capable of breathtaking beauty and unspeakable horror, often within the same generation. And they had done something that no species in the history of the Communion had ever done. They had left their world before they were ready, not by accident, not by necessity, but by choice. They had looked at the stars, understood that they did not have the technology to reach them safely, and had decided to go anyway. The data included historical records of their space program, and these records made Valith's crew uncomfortable in ways they could not articulate. The early attempts were almost unbearable to review. Crude rockets that exploded on launch pads, capsules that burned up during re-entry, missions that ended in disaster and death, followed almost immediately by new missions, new crews, new attempts. The humans did not learn caution from failure. They learned lessons, applied them, and tried again, and again, and again. There was a specific recording that Drayan flagged and brought to Valith's attention. It showed a moment from early in the human space program, long before they had built the Wanderer, long before they had even left the orbit of their own world. 3 humans had been killed when their spacecraft caught fire during a routine test on the ground. The recording showed the aftermath, the grief, the anger, the investigations and hearings and accusations. And then it showed what happened next. Within 2 years, the humans had redesigned the spacecraft, fixed the flaws, and sent 3 new humans to their moon. They had walked on its surface, planted a flag, and come home. They had named the mission Apollo. In their mythology, Apollo was a god of light. Valith watched the recording in silence. She watched the grainy images of a human in a crude spacesuit standing on the barren surface of a lifeless moon, looking up at the blue sphere of their home world hanging in the black sky. She watched and she understood something that the data alone could not convey. These creatures were not reckless because they did not understand the danger. They were reckless because they understood it perfectly and had decided that the danger was less important than the need to go. They had weighed their lives against the stars and found their lives lighter. "Commander," Drayan said, interrupting her thoughts. "Captain Vasquez is requesting permission to meet face to face. She wishes to come aboard the Quiet Tide." Valeth hesitated. Face-to-face contact during a first encounter was unusual. The standard protocol called for extended communication at a distance, a gradual building of trust and understanding before any physical meeting took place. But these humans did not seem like the type to wait for gradual anything. "Tell her we accept," Valeth said. "Prepare the docking bay. And Drayan, make sure our atmosphere is compatible with their biology." "It will need to be adjusted," Drayan said. "Their oxygen requirements are higher than ours, and they prefer a warmer temperature. I can modify the docking bay environment to accommodate them." "Do it." The preparations took an hour. During that time, Valeth learned more about humans from their data stream. She learned that they had over 7,000 distinct languages, a number so absurdly large that Drain initially assumed it was a translation error. She learned that they had spent most of their history fighting each other over territory, resources, and ideas. She learned that they had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire civilization and had come within minutes of using them on multiple occasions. She learned that they told stories constantly, obsessively, compulsively, stories about everything, about heroes and villains and monsters and lovers and gods and ordinary people doing ordinary things. They told stories the way other species breathed. It was involuntary, essential, unstoppable. And she learned about the music. The music was everywhere in their data. Thousands of forms, millions of individual compositions, an ocean of sound that spanned their entire history. Music for celebration and mourning. Music for love and war. Music for quiet moments alone and for vast gatherings of thousands. Music that was simple and music that was so complex it required hundreds of individuals working in perfect coordination to perform. They made music with their voices, with their hands, with devices they had built specifically for the purpose of creating sound. They made music out of everything, out of strings and air and electricity and mathematics and silence. The song that had first reached the Quiet Tide, the one with the words "Ground Control to Major Tom," was a story set to music. The translation was imperfect, but the meaning was clear enough. It was about a man in a spacecraft floating above his world, speaking to the people who had sent him there. It was about the distance between home and the unknown. It was about the beauty and the terror of being completely alone in the vastness of space. It was about letting go. The humans aboard the Wanderer had chosen this song as their greeting to whatever they found at the end of their journey. They had crossed 4 light years of empty space, watched 5 of their crew members die along the way, and when they finally encountered another intelligent species for the first time in their history, the first thing they had done was play a song about loneliness and wonder. Valeth did not know whether to be moved or frightened. She settled on both. The docking bay had been prepared. The atmosphere was adjusted, warmer and richer in oxygen than Valeth found comfortable, but the humans needed it to breathe. The lighting was softened because the data suggested that human eyes were sensitive to the bright illumination that the Torvan preferred. Everything was ready. A shuttle detached from the Wanderer. It was even cruder than the mothership, a small, boxy craft with stubby wings and visible rivets trailing a faint plume of chemical exhaust. It crossed the gap between the two vessels slowly, carefully, and settled onto the docking bay floor with a heavy thud and a hiss of equalizing pressure. Valeth stood at the entrance to the docking bay, with Drain at her side and a small honor guard of 4 officers behind her. Standard protocol for a diplomatic first contact. She straightened her uniform, composed her expression, and waited. The shuttle's hatch opened with a grinding sound of metal on metal. A ramp extended, striking the deck with a clang that echoed through the bay. And then, for a long moment, nothing happened. The interior of the shuttle was dark, and Valeth could see nothing inside. Then a figure appeared in the hatchway. It stepped forward into the light of the docking bay, and Valeth saw a human being for the first time. Captain Elena Vasquez was smaller than Valeth had expected. The humans were shorter than the Torvan by a significant margin, and lighter, with a frame that looked almost fragile by comparison. She had dark hair cut short, and her skin was a warm brown color, lined and weathered by age and hard living. Her eyes were dark and bright and steady, and they moved constantly, taking in everything around her, with a sharpness that Valeth recognized immediately. This was a predator's awareness. This woman was not afraid, but she was alert. She was ready. She was old. That was the second thing Valeth noticed. The data had said that humans had a natural lifespan of approximately 80 to 100 years, and this woman appeared to be near the upper end of that range. She had been young when the Wanderer launched. She had spent her entire adult life inside that ship. Captain Vasquez walked down the ramp slowly. She was wearing a uniform of some kind, dark blue, worn thin at the elbows and knees, patched in several places. On her chest was a small emblem, a circle containing the image of their home world, blue and green and white, with a ring of stars around it. She carried nothing in her hands, no weapons, no tools, no gifts or offerings, just herself. She reached the bottom of the ramp and stopped. She looked up at Valeth, and for a moment the two of them simply stood there, separated by a few meters of deck plating and several billion years of independent evolution, staring at each other in silence. Then Captain Vasquez smiled. It was a small smile, tired but genuine, and it transformed her entire face. Lines deepened around her eyes and mouth, and something warm and unguarded appeared in her expression that Valeth could not look away from. "Hello?" the captain said. The translation came through clean and clear. "We have come a very long way to say that." Valeth found that her voice did not work on the first try. She cleared her throat and spoke carefully. "Welcome to Torvan Space, Captain Vasquez. The Galactic Communion greets you." "Thank you," the captain said. "Is it all right if I sit down? My legs are not what they used to be." Of all the things she had prepared for, of all the diplomatic statements and formal greetings and carefully worded exchanges she had rehearsed, she had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for a tired old woman asking to sit down. "Of course," Valeth said. She gestured to an officer who quickly brought a seat. Captain Vasquez lowered herself into it with a sigh of relief and rubbed her knees with both hands. "Gravity on this ship is a little higher than what I am used to," she said. "The Wanderer keeps things light to save energy. My bones have gotten lazy." Behind her, two more humans emerged from the shuttle. They were younger than the captain, a man and a woman, both wearing the same worn blue uniform. They stood at the bottom of the ramp and looked around the docking bay with wide eyes. The man appeared to be on the verge of tears. The woman was grinning so broadly that Valeth could see all of her teeth, a display that the Torvan associated with aggression but which the data suggested was a human expression of happiness. "These are my officers," Captain Vasquez said. "Lieutenant Commander James Okafor, my engineer, and Dr. Sarah Chen, our chief scientist. The rest of the crew are aboard the Wanderer, monitoring systems. We did not want to leave the ship unattended. She has been our home for a long time." "We understand," Valeth said. She paused, searching for the right words. The formal phrases of diplomatic protocol seemed inadequate. These people had not come here as representatives of a galactic power. They had come here as survivors. They had crawled across the void in a metal box, and they were still standing, still smiling, still asking permission to sit down because their legs were tired. "Captain Vasquez," Valeth said slowly, "your journey, the distance you have traveled, the method by which you traveled it. We have never seen anything like it. In the entire history of the Galactic Communion, no species has ever crossed between star systems without faster-than-light capability. You are the first." Captain Vasquez looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "We are good at being first," she said quietly. "It is one of our better qualities, sometimes our only quality." "You said Galactic Communion. How many species are in your communion?" 914, Valeth said. The captain let out a long, slow breath. The man behind her, Okafor, made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. Dr. Chen's grin widened even further. 914, Captain Vasquez repeated, "and not one of them ever did what we just did." "No," Valeth said, "not one." The captain was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into a pocket of her uniform and pulled out a small, flat object. It was rectangular, made of some kind of rigid material. and it contained a visual image, a photograph. The data called it a static capture of a moment in time. She held it out to Valith. "This is Earth," she said. "Our home." This photograph was taken from orbit 200 years ago by the first humans to leave our atmosphere. I have carried it with me since the day we launched. Valith took the photograph carefully. It showed a sphere of blue and white and green, swirled with clouds hanging in the darkness of space. It was small, fragile-looking, beautiful in the way that simple things are beautiful. "We will probably never see it again," Captain Vasquez said. Her voice was steady, but something in it cracked, just slightly, just for a moment. "We knew that when we left. We said goodbye to everyone we loved, and we climbed into that ship and we flew away from everything we had ever known. Because someone had to be first. Someone had to go and find out if we were alone." She looked at Valith and her smile returned. Smaller now, more fragile, but still there. "Still burning. And now we know," she said. "We are not alone." Valith held the photograph of Earth and felt the weight of it. Not the physical weight, which was almost nothing, but the other weight. The weight of what it meant. The weight of what these impossible creatures had done and what it had cost them. She looked at Captain Elena Vasquez, a tired old woman in a patched uniform, sitting in a borrowed chair on an alien ship 4 light years from a home she would never see again, and she made a decision that went against every protocol, every regulation, every established procedure in the history of the Galactic Communion. "Captain Vasquez," she said, "I would like to hear more about your world. I would like to hear more about your people. And I would like to hear more of your music." The captain's eyes lit up. "Commander," she said, "I thought you would never ask." The news traveled faster than light. That was the irony. The humans could not cross the distance between stars without spending a lifetime inside a metal box. But the report of their arrival crossed the Galactic Communion in hours. Quantum-entangled communication channels carried the message from the Torvan system to the Communion's capital at Verath Prime, and from there it spread outward like ripples in still water, reaching every member world, every station, every outpost in the vast network of civilizations that had existed in relative peace for longer than some stars had been burning. The message was simple. A new species had been contacted. They called themselves humans. It came from a small world called Earth, and they had arrived in the most impossible way that anyone in the Communion had ever seen. Within days, the Communion Council was in emergency session. The Great Chamber at Verath Prime, a vast dome of crystallized light that could hold representatives from every member species, was full for the first time in 300 years. 914 species, each with their own form, their own language, their own history and culture and way of understanding the universe, all gathered to discuss the same question. What do we do about the humans? The debate was fierce. It lasted for weeks. The data from the Quiet Tides encounter had been shared with every member world, and every member world had a different reaction to it. Some were fascinated. Some were horrified. Some were both. The Violani, a species of aquatic beings who communicated through bioluminescent patterns, were the first to formally object to continued contact. Their representative pulsed a deep red that the translation systems rendered as grave concern. The humans were too young, too volatile, too unpredictable. Their history was soaked in blood. They had developed weapons of mass destruction before they had developed interstellar travel. They were, by any reasonable measure, dangerous. The protocols existed for a reason. Species that had not achieved faster-than-light capability were to be left alone. The humans should be returned to their own system and monitored from a distance until they matured. The Crethani, a collective intelligence that existed as a network of interconnected organisms spread across an entire planet, disagreed. The Crethani had studied the human data extensively and had reached a conclusion that disturbed many of the other species in the chamber. The humans, the Crethani argued, were not immature. They were different. They had developed along a path that no other species had ever taken, not because they were behind, but because they were wired differently. Their brains, their biology, their psychology, all of it pushed them toward a form of behavior that the Communion had no framework to understand. The humans did not wait for safety. They did not wait for certainty. They moved forward through uncertainty, through danger, through failure and death and loss, and they did not stop. They could not stop. It was built into them at the deepest level. They were not a species that explored. They were a species that could not stop exploring. The Krathani's assessment was met with uncomfortable silence. Meanwhile, aboard the Quiet Tide, Commander Valeth was learning this for herself. Captain Vasquez and her crew had been aboard the Torvan vessel for 3 days. Valeth had offered them quarters, medical attention, food, and rest. The humans had accepted all of these things gratefully, but what they wanted most was to talk. They wanted to know everything. Every detail about the communion, about the other species, about the technology, the history, the politics, the art, the science. They absorbed information like dry ground absorbing rain. And no matter how much Valeth gave them, they wanted more. Dr. Chen had spent 14 hours in the Quiet Tide's medical bay, not because she was injured, but because she wanted to understand how Torvan biology worked. She had asked questions that the ship's medical officer had never been asked before, probing and detailed and occasionally embarrassing. And she had taken notes on a small device that she carried with her everywhere, filling it with observations and sketches and theories. She was, Valeth realized, doing science. Not with instruments or equipment, but with her eyes and her mind, and an appetite for knowledge that was almost physical in its intensity. Lieutenant Commander Okafor had found his way to the engine room, the Quiet Tide's chief engineer, a massive Torvan named Holleth who had served aboard the vessel for 20 years and thought he had seen everything, had been completely unprepared for the human engineer's reaction to the gravity drive. Okafor had stood in front of the drive housing, a sleek cylinder of polished metal that hummed with the controlled manipulation of gravitational fields, and he had wept, openly, without shame, tears running down his dark face as he reached out and touched the housing with both hands. He had spent his entire adult life maintaining combustion engines. He had kept the Wanderer's crude propulsion system running through 73 years of constant use, replacing parts, fabricating new components from raw materials, improvising solutions to problems that no engineering manual had ever anticipated. He was a genius by any standard, and he was standing in front of a technology that made everything he had ever built look like a child's toy. And instead of despair, what Valeth saw on his face was joy. "It is beautiful," Okafor had said, his voice thick with emotion. "I always knew something like this was possible. I could feel it. I just could not prove it, but here it is." "Here it is." Holleth had looked at Valeth with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something like respect, but deeper. Something like recognition. "This human," Holleth had said privately to Valeth later, "understands our engines better than some of my own officers. He does not know the physics. He does not know the mathematics. But he understands the principles. He grasps them intuitively. I showed him the basic equations, and he adapted them to his own mathematical notation in less than an hour." "Commander, this species learns faster than anything I have ever seen." Valeth was not surprised. She had been watching Captain Vasquez do the same thing with diplomatic and cultural information. The old captain had a mind like a steel trap, sharp and relentless, and she was building a map of communion politics and relationships with a speed that would have taken a trained Torvan diplomat years. She asked the right questions. She noticed the gaps in what she was told. She read body language across species boundaries with an accuracy that should have been impossible for someone who had never seen a non-human being before 3 days ago. On the 4th day, Valeth received orders from the Communion Council. The orders were a compromise, as all council decisions were. The humans were to be treated as guests but not as members. They were to be given access to basic technology but not advanced systems. They were to be allowed to remain in Torvan space while a more permanent arrangement was negotiated. And they were to be studied carefully and thoroughly to determine whether they posed a threat to the communion's stability. Valeth read the orders and felt a heaviness settle over her. She understood the council's caution. She shared some of it. The humans were unlike anything the communion had encountered, and their history gave legitimate cause for concern. A species that had nearly destroyed itself with its own weapons, that had poisoned its own world, that had fought wars over ideas and territory and resources for the entire span of its existence, was not a species that could be trusted blindly. But Valeth had spent 4 days with these humans, and she had seen something that the council had not. She had seen the other side of them. She had seen Okafor weeping with joy at the sight of a gravity drive. She had seen Chen spending sleepless hours trying to understand alien biology, not for any strategic purpose, but because she burned with curiosity that she could not contain. She had seen Vasquez sit quietly in the observation lounge, looking out at the stars with an expression of such profound wonder and gratitude that Valeth had felt her own hearts tighten. And she had heard the music. On the second night, Captain Vasquez had asked permission to share something with Valeth's crew. Valeth had agreed, and the captain had connected her small personal device to the ship's audio system. What followed was something that no one aboard the Quiet Tide had ever experienced. It began with a single instrument. Chen explained that it was called a piano, a device that produced sound by striking tuned strings with padded hammers. The sound it made was unlike any Torvan instrument. It was warm and rounded, and full of overtones that shimmered in the air like light on water. The melody was simple at first, a few notes repeated in a pattern that was easy to follow, easy to anticipate, but then it began to change. New notes appeared, unexpected ones, notes that bent the pattern without breaking it, that took the melody somewhere it had not been before and made it seem, somehow, as if it had always been going there. Layers of sound built upon each other, rising and falling, creating harmonies that were mathematical in their precision and emotional in their effect. The crew of the Quiet Tide stood perfectly still and listened. Some of them closed their eyes. Some of them could not. The music filled the observation lounge and spilled out into the corridors beyond. And crew members who were not on duty came to stand in the doorways and listen. When it ended, the silence was absolute. "What was that?" Valeth had asked. "Beethoven," Captain Vasquez had said. "He was one of our composers. He wrote that piece almost 300 years ago. He was going deaf when he wrote it. He could barely hear the sounds he was creating. He wrote music for a world he could no longer fully experience." Valeth had stared at her. He created this while losing the ability to hear? He was furious about it, heartbroken. But he did not stop. He wrote some of his greatest work after he could hear almost nothing at all. He felt the vibrations through the floor. He held a stick between his teeth and pressed it against the instrument to feel the notes in his skull. He refused to let go of the thing he loved most, and there it was. The thing that defined these creatures. The thing that made them different from every other species in the communion. It was not their technology which was primitive. It was not their biology which was unremarkable. It was not their intelligence which, while impressive, was within the range of other species. It was their refusal. Their absolute, bone-deep, irrational refusal to accept limitations. When the universe told them they could not do something, they did not argue. They did not complain. They simply found another way. They built a ship out of metal and fire because they did not have gravity drives. They crossed 4 light years in 73 years because they could not fold space. They made music when they were going deaf because the silence was unacceptable. They were impossible. And they were here. Valeth delivered the council's orders to Captain Vasquez in the privacy of the captain's temporary quarters. The old woman listened carefully, her expression neutral, her dark eyes missing nothing. When Valeth finished, Vasquez was quiet for a long time. "They are afraid of us," she said. It was not a question. "They are cautious," Valeth said carefully. "They are afraid of us," Vasquez repeated, "because of our history. Because we are violent and unpredictable and young, and we arrived in a way that frightens them." Valeth could not deny it. "Yes," Valeth said, nodded slowly. "They should be afraid. Not because we intend harm. We do not. But because they are right about us. We are everything they think we are. We are violent. We have done terrible things to each other and to our world. We have been cruel and stupid and short-sighted. All of that is true." She paused. "But it is not all that is true. We are also the species that sent 12 people across 4 light years in a metal box because we needed to know what was out there. We are the species that wrote symphonies and painted sunsets and told stories around fires for 100,000 years. We are the species that looked at the impossible and said, 'Not yet,' instead of 'never.' That is also true. Both things are true at the same time." She looked at Valeth with an expression that was neither defiant nor pleading. It was simply honest. "Tell your council this," Vasquez said. "We did not come here to conquer, or to take, or to prove anything. We came here because the question was too big to leave unanswered. Are we alone?" That question burned inside us for as long as we have been a thinking species. It burned in us when we looked up at the night sky and saw the stars and did not understand what they were. It burned in us when we built our first telescopes and saw how vast the universe was and how small we were inside it. It burned in us when we launched our first rockets and stood on our own moon and looked back at our home and realized that everything we had ever known and loved existed on that tiny blue dot. The question never stopped burning, so we came to find the answer. She paused, and for the first time in the conversation, something cracked in her composure. Her eyes glistened, her voice thinned, but she did not look away. 5 of my people died answering that question. Their names were Robert Kim, Anna Petrov, David Lawson, Yuki Tanaka, and Marcus Cole. They died in the dark between stars, far from home, far from everyone they loved, and they died knowing that it was worth it. They died with their eyes open and their hearts full, because they knew that even if they did not live to see the end of the journey itself mattered. The act of going mattered. The refusal to stay put mattered. She straightened in her chair, and the fragility vanished, replaced by something harder, something forged in 73 years of darkness and loss and stubborn, burning hope. We are not a perfect species. We are not even a particularly wise species. But we are a species that does not stop. We get knocked down, and we get back up. We fail and we try again. We lose people we love, and we carry them with us, and we keep going. That is who we are. That is what you are dealing with. And I hope, with everything I have, that your communion will see that as a strength and not a threat. Valeth listened, and when the captain was finished, she stood in silence for a long time. She thought about the protocols and the regulations and the careful, measured way the communion had always done things. She thought about 914 species, all of whom had reached the stars the right way, the safe way, the approved way. She thought about the wanderer, scarred and patched and held together by stubbornness, floating in the void outside her ship. And she thought about the music, the deaf man writing symphonies he could not hear, the song about ground control and Major Tom, the sound that had crossed the void and reached her bridge and made her feel something she had never felt before. She reached a decision. Captain Vasquez, Valeth said, I will deliver your message to the council. I will deliver it personally. And I will add my own recommendation, which is the tired, weathered, impossible old woman who had crossed the stars in a metal box because she needed to know. My recommendation will be that the Galactic Communion has nothing to fear from humanity, Valeth said, and everything to learn. The message was transmitted that evening. It crossed the Communion in hours, carrying Valeth's words and Vasquez's speech, and the recording of the music and the data and the photographs and all the impossible, wonderful, terrifying evidence of what a species could do when it refused to accept the word impossible. The council debated for another month. There were objections and concerns and heated arguments that crossed species lines and cultural boundaries. But in the end, the vote was not even close. The humans were welcomed into the Galactic Communion, not as observers or guests or subjects of study, but as members, full members, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. The vote was 879 in favor, 35 opposed, with the remainder abstaining. It was the largest majority in council history. When the news reached the quiet tide, Captain Vasquez was in the observation lounge, looking out at the stars. Valeth found her there and told her the result. The old captain listened, nodded once, and then turned back to the window. Captain, Valeth said, are you all right? Vasquez was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 73 years, she said. 12 of us left Earth. 7 of us are still here. And now we are not alone anymore. She took a long, unsteady breath. I wish Robert and Anna and David and Yuki and Marcus could have seen this. They would have loved this. They are here, Valeth said. She was surprised to hear herself say it. It was not something a Torvan officer would normally say. But she meant it. They are here because you carried them. Because you did not stop. Vasquez looked at her, and for the first time since they had met, the captain's composure broke completely. Tears ran down her weathered face, and she did not wipe them away. She let them fall, and she smiled through them, a smile that was grief and joy and exhaustion and triumph all at once. Thank you, she said, for hearing us, for listening to our song. Valeth reached out and placed one of her hands over the captain's. The human's hand was small and warm and rough with age. It trembled slightly. Captain Vasquez, Valeth said, the communion has existed for 14 billion rotations. We have welcomed 914 species. We have mapped galaxies and harnessed stars and built wonders that your people cannot yet imagine. But in all that time, in all that history, no one has ever done what you did. No one has ever crossed the dark the way you crossed it. No one has ever arrived the way you arrived, singing. She tightened her grip on the captain's hand. Your species asks whether it has anything to offer a community of 914 civilizations that have existed for billions of years. The answer is yes. You have something that none of us have. You have the willingness to go before you are ready. You have the courage to fail and the stubbornness to try again. You have music made by deaf composers and poetry written in the dark and stories told around fires that have been burning for 100,000 years. You have the audacity to love something so much that you will cross the void to find it, knowing you might die along the way, and call that a fair trade. She released the captain's hand and stood straight. The Communion does not need your technology, Captain. It does not need your resources or your military capability or your scientific knowledge, all of which are, forgive me, quite primitive. What the Communion needs, what it has always needed and never known it was missing, is what you brought with you across those 4 light years. Vasquez wiped her eyes. And what is that? Valith looked out the observation window at the Wanderer, the ugly, beautiful, impossible ship floating in the starlight, its hull scarred and patched and still whole, still pointing forward, still going. The song, Valith said. You brought the song. And far below them, drifting in the light of alien stars, the Wanderer turned slowly, its name painted on its hull in letters that were already becoming legend, a testament to a species that had looked at the impossible distance between the stars and had not waited for the universe to make it easier. They had simply gone. They had gone with fire and metal and stubbornness and love, and they had arrived with music on their lips and tears on their faces, and their hands reaching out toward the unknown. Ground control! To Major Tom, the stars had answered, and humanity at last had come home.